Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our session on ensuring a just transition. I'm Vijay Vaidiswaran. I'm the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor of The Economist, and it's my great pleasure to host this session on an absolutely vital topic as we think about how to transform the global economy to cope with the disruptions coming from climate change, how to pull off an energy transition of the sort and speed and scale that we've never done in human history before. How do we do this in a manner that is just? As leaders prepare to gather for COP26, the big climate change meeting in Scotland coming up, how do we ensure that the questions of justice are on the agenda as well as the questions of finance, of politics, and technology that are already prominent in the news? Who will be the winners and losers, and how to ensure a more equitable response? To help us think through these important questions, we have three distinguished speakers. I'll introduce them briefly, and we'll have a chance to hear from them in short order. Jennifer Morgan, Chief Executive of Greenpeace. Mikola Krishnan, who's a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. And Gautam Narasimhan, Senior Advisor for Climate, Energy, and Environment at UNICEF. Welcome to my panelists. Thank you for joining us here at The Economist. Jennifer, why don't we start with you? How aligned do you think the union and green movements are on the topic of the climate transition? There's been discussions about, for example, the Green-Blue Alliance in American political discussions and around the world, questions about whether there are trade-offs between jobs, moving from the dirty economy to the clean economy, or is there a win-win where you can both create jobs as well as transition? What's your perspective on this question about the relationship between labor and greenery?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with all of you and discuss this incredibly important topic. I think that the green movement has really changed over the past years, and there's a growing recognition that there can be no environmental justice without social justice. And so it's led to a shift away from, I think, I can speak for the green movement. I can speak for Greenpeace. I can't speak for unions, but a move away from a binary kind of a view of the world into something that is much more interdependent and connected, and where you see that, workers, I think, and Greenpeace are working together, both in helping define just transitions, making sure that they're at the table, looking at Greenpeace and other environmental movements, using what we can in the tools that we have and the communications we have to bring those issues front and center into the debate. And I think it really is looking together about how to equip ourselves to take on the systems of power that both the Green and the Union movement have been working to try and change for many years. So it's different. Still work to be done, but I think there's a real recognition that we're in this together, and therefore we're collaborating nationally and internationally, as I think we haven't done before.
So it's very interesting. You talk about some changes in attitude in the green side of the equation, the one that you can speak more for, but also opportunities. Can you identify a couple of areas where you do see where that green transition that needs to happen at this time it produces clear wins for labor as well? And the reason I ask, economists will typically be skeptical about suggestions that things are win-win. They typically like to look at trade-offs and argue that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And if you don't believe me, just ask the oil pipeline workers who want pipelines and more oil, and of course, environmental groups that don't. So there is a history of there being a difference of opinion or of interests and alliances in some areas. If you have a different view, what are the most promising examples of where there are enough fruits to be picked that everybody can enjoy them?
Well, I think maybe just a couple of examples. So one is also where Greenpeace is active. For example, in Poland, on the Gdansk shipyards, we all remember those shipyards from the Solidarity movement. But now those same workers are building the wind turbines and using the experience they have to actually help build offshore wind turbines. And so you're using an existing set of skills and you're applying them into a technology that is needed for the transformation. Another example is actually going on right now in Romania, in a place called Gorge, where Greenpeace has been working there with coal miners. It's a main lignite region in Romania. And there, what's happening is actually looking at where the solutions are, and looking for the energy efficiency side of things, where those workers are moving in to those branches. But you also have Greenpeace and the unions working together to access the support from the European Union funds that are there. So us using our knowledge of those processes and working together so that there can be the needed support for those workers. I think there's two parts of this. One is the workers that are currently there, and we've done work with them also in the UK and surveys of how to have them at the table, and that they can move into new jobs and new sectors. But it's complex. I mean, I don't want to say it's easy. You have people who have lived in their towns and in their communities forever. And I think it really is very much of a responsibility of government and of course of the corporations to make sure that there is the training that is there, that there is the support for the social safety net that is there, and that those individuals do have a chance to move forward into those new jobs. Then, of course, there's the new jobs that are emerging. Maybe we can get to that later, but in the green economy. But you need to be thinking about the whole.
That's great. It's actually a good jumping off point to turn to Mikaela. Your work at the McKinsey Global Institute looks a lot at the transition and the winners and losers in the transition. Can you help us understand the scale and nature of what we're likely to see happen across sectors and geographies as the global energy transition unfolds, and hopefully will unfold at an increasing pace if the challenge of climate change and the goals of the Paris Accord are to be met?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think this is a good jumping off point from what Jennifer was saying. Firstly, I would call it not an energy transition alone, but a net zero transition. And the reason I use that phrase is actually it is important to think about it as a transition, meaning we end up in a world where we have, if all goes well, we have addressed the climate crisis, we have achieved net zero emissions, we have transformed how energy is provided to different sectors and countries in the world. So that end state, I think we can all now agree, is a desirable end state. The key is how we go from here to that end state. And so I think it's important to frame it as a transition, because it leads to not just the need for an energy transition, but also an agricultural transition. So our forms of production and consumption need to change. But that then leads to a set of cascading transition. It needs to then result in a job transition. So how our workforce structures today will not be what they look like in the future. And so we need to think about a job transition. We need to think about a capital transition. So where capital is allocated today is not going to be where capital needs to be allocated in the future. So there are a set of cascading transitions it then triggers, which is then the challenge of what we need to solve in the near term. Right? How do we smoothen the transition to the extent we can for those that are most affected? How do we minimize risks? How do we maximize opportunities? And how do we ensure an orderly transition? And I think this goes back to the premise of this panel on the just transition. Without a focus on that just transition, we don't think the transition will be orderly. And indeed, there's a risk that the transition itself is derailed. So let's talk about the nature and magnitude of the winners and losers. There's a range of things that get triggered as the transition unfolds. Demand shifts, so demand for high carbon products decreases, demand for low carbon products increases, capital gets reallocated, cost structures change in certain sectors. As we implement decarbonization technologies, particularly in the hard to abate sectors, costs increase and jobs are affected, right? So at a first order, even there's a whole range of impacts: demand, capital, cost, jobs. What that then leads to is implications for sectors and companies, implications for countries, and then implications for consumers and workers. And each of these sets of entities are affected. So if we think about sectors for a moment, every sector touches energy in some way. We find with our research about 30% of sectors are disproportionately exposed. That's where the bulk of emissions are directly produced, or the products that they produce result in emissions. So there's an unevenness in how sectors are affected. And so while all sectors are affected, some are affected disproportionately. Certain countries
and is it
are
right to
affected.
say that those are probably the resource intensive sectors, oil and gas, commodities, or the industries that use a lot of those inputs? That's reasonable to assume, right?
So it's three categories of sectors, I would say. The first is, as you said, the sectors that are resource intensive. I would characterize that slightly differently. It's sectors the use of whose products creates emissions. So it's oil and gas on the one hand, but it's also automotive on the other hand, in the form of the current automotive industry. And the reason I put that category is because the products in that sector are fundamentally affected, right? And so the need for the industry to transform, think about different types of products, that imperative gets created. The second is sectors that themselves directly produce emissions. So this is, for example, the power sector, the agriculture sector. And then the third, as you said, is those that use emissions-intensive inputs in their production, like the construction industry. So these sectors are fundamentally more affected because the nature of their products, how they manage their operations, where and how they source will be affected disproportionately compared to the rest of the economy, which really their contribution is the use of electricity, right? There is an unevenness when it comes to sectors and companies that are affected. There is an unevenness also when it comes to countries that are affected. Go ahead, Vijay.
We started talking about winners and losers. And since we're talking about the heavily affected sectors, just to drill down on one point rather than covering 10,000 points superficially, let's just spend a moment on this. The sectors that you've identified, even though they're heavily affected, are they necessarily losers? Or is it simply a question of, for example, depending on how policies are designed and how businesses respond, that there may be costs of transition? Because when I think about the energy industry, I can't imagine any future in a net zero carbon world where we don't use energy. Somebody's going to supply that energy. It'll maybe a different form. It may certainly, and the way we distribute it. So how do we organize systems when we think about winners and losers, where we can also show those who are most affected today or disrupted opportunities to play a constructive role in the future? Is that the role for policy? Or do you think that's the role of markets and self-interest will take care of that? Just in the question of winners and losers and how to make that less preordained. Because if a certain group is seen as losers, they're likely to fight the change, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the winners and losers phrase is a very stark phrase, right? So ultimately, it is about how do we support the transition to this end state world that we most desire. In terms of who actually needs to drive that transition, we fundamentally believe it needs to be an all of system response, right? So markets have a role to play, and indeed, we're already seeing capital markets start to price this into their decision making, start to factor this into capital allocation. Of course, the scale of that needs to change. But markets playing a role in that will then in turn incentivize companies to do that, to take action. I think governments have a strong role to play, both to create the right incentives, subsidies, enabling mechanisms, but also in some cases, particularly when it comes to workers and consumers, actually protect the most vulnerable, support the transitions with the kind of programs Jennifer was also describing when it comes to reskilling, redeployment, economic diversification schemes, etc. And then I think companies and consumers also have a role to play. So for companies, they need to both understand the actions they can take to reach this net zero world. They need to understand the risks that they're exposed to as policy action unfolds, as investor action unfolds, and how they manage those risks. They need to identify opportunities for themselves to capture. And then consumers also need to play a role to the extent that consumer behavior shifts can actually then cascade to drive the transition in the real economy. That is also a crucial unlock. So it does need to be an all of system response. In different sectors, I think different stakeholders have a more active role to play, but no actor is immune here, and everyone needs to participate.
Great. So that gives us a really powerful vision from the top down. Let's flip the script and look at the bottom up. Gautam, you spend a lot of time thinking about children and their vulnerability to climate change. Can you give us a sense about when we talk about justice and the transition, what is, other than of course, the almost blindingly obvious fact that the world will be inherited by children who haven't contributed to the climate change problem but must live with its consequences, the injustice of the very nature of the problem. But beyond that, can you talk about how children are uniquely vulnerable to climate change?
Vijay, thanks very much. And echoing, thanks very much for having us be part of this. You're right. I mean, coming in from the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, our focus and everything that we do is centered around what is right to secure the rights of every child. And as you mentioned, there's the sort of the blindingly obvious, why do we do climate and environmental action? And that's to bequeath a livable planet for our children. But even beyond that, even if you look at the short-term impacts of climate change, for example, the number of extreme weather events and disasters has increased by 30% since the 1990s, and children are more vulnerable to the immediate impacts of these disasters. They are more physically vulnerable. When we talk about the increased impacts of air pollution, children's respiratory systems are more vulnerable than those of adults. When we speak of the impacts of malnutrition, children are more vulnerable. So it's these immediate impacts. But it's also the intermediate impacts of through the course of a child's life. When we're talking about the impacts that this is going to have upon industries and agricultural systems, it is children that will have to live their lives through the course of this transition. And perhaps ending a little bit where Jennifer started off, this is a story again of inequality and injustice, but injustice in the sense that these impacts are going to be felt intergenerationally. The worst impacts are going to be felt upon children in countries that are the poorest and children who are the poorest in those countries. And those impacts become worse upon their children. So you're perpetuating these cycles of intergenerational inequality to where poorer children will become poorer in their lifetimes and poorer still as time goes on. And which is why, again, when we're speaking about a just transition, we really need to be asking ourselves, to whose benefit are we directing climate change response? And there's far too little of it that's going towards children in the most vulnerable countries. I mean, UNICEF has done some analysis, pulling in data sources from a lot of different places, where we tried to superimpose sort of environmental and climate shocks and stresses on one hand, and the coping mechanisms that are available in countries where children grow up on the other. And what you see there is, for example, that amongst the 10 most vulnerable countries, that they contribute only something like 0.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, it is very critical that we have energy transitions in these countries, but just as important is adaptation and providing the kinds of mechanisms to where children in these countries have the systems to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Because, and here I'll end, given all the goodwill in the world, I mean, the recent IPCC report that came out spoke about, yes, that, a 1.5 degree future is still within reach. Though, of course, if you look at commitments that are coming out, we're unlikely to get there. But even with that 1.5 degree commitment, the impacts of climate change, many of them are irreversible. We are not going to move back to the moderate weather of yesteryear. Some of those impacts are reversible. They're here, and they're likely to get worse, because even given all the goodwill and forecasts of emissions reductions, even the most optimistic forecasts, climate dynamics are such that these will take decades to kick in. And these will take decades to kick in and will be worst felt by children in countries that are experiencing a demographic bulge. So unless we speak about how we're helping children in these countries adapt to the impacts of climate change, we're forsaking the futures of generations of children in countries that will be affected the worst.
So, Gautam, you've made a powerful and compelling case. Unfortunately, a very depressing one, but certainly one that is compelling. That children are particularly vulnerable, and you've made the case that adaptation is something that we need to invest more in. That's generally true for everyone, adults and children alike, particularly in developing countries. Can you give a couple of specific examples of what sorts of adaptation we need to invest more in or to encourage that would be especially beneficial for children? What do you have in mind at UNICEF?
And there's as you said, and there's some great analysis already out there. For example, and we're looking at this from the perspective of what make good investments. There's some very good evidence that, for example, investing in early warning systems that has benefits of over 7 or 8 to 1 for every dollar invested. And the data shows that even providing early warning systems.
Sorry, just to be clear, the early warnings
Yep.
would be for weather events like potential tsunamis,
Right.
as opposed to pandemic surveillance or something like that, which is also an early warning system.
Absolutely. In this, we're focusing it to extreme weather events. And even 24 hours of warning, if you have systems of 24 hours of warning, that can reduce risk and damage by about a third. And If you look at investments in climate resilient water and sanitation systems, better water treatment mechanisms, etc., these have benefits and paybacks of over 4 to 1. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of early warning systems and investments in climate resilient basic social services, water and sanitation, health, education, etc.
Now, is it fair to say that the things you've outlined at the top of your list are things that were good to do anyway, even before we begin to take account climate change specifically or the particular vulnerabilities of children? Because in that vulnerable village, grandma benefits as much from that early warning system as does her grandchild. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, because I mean, we can't be speaking about children without their caregivers, of course, and it's children that are part of a community. And you're absolutely right to say that many of these things are things that we should be doing and would make good investments anyway. But what has changed is that as the results of climate change increase, that both the payback and the absolute urgency of implementing these systems and directing the right sorts of innovation, capital, and policies towards prioritizing these investments, the need for them is growing. Is growing.
I want to see if we can pick up on the point about adaptation and the economics of adaptation. Mikola, can you tell us a little bit about your analysis that you have on that pillar? And of course, we have different pillars that we think about when in responding to climate change. Much of the attention tends to be on mitigation efforts and global deals. We've woefully underinvested in adaptation over the years. We recently ran a story looking at private sector investment in adaptation, which is amounted to far less than 2% of global investment in adaptation to begin with. Although there's some positive signs that increasing flows of funds are coming and maybe even some innovative instruments in insurance markets and so on. But how do we address the problem that Gautam has increased from your point of view? And how do we get that engine going to dramatically improve adaptation investments?
Absolutely. And I completely agree that regardless of what we do on mitigation, some amount of physical risks are locked into the system. We are going to have to make adaptation investments. Some of the numbers Gautam was alluding to, the 7 to 1, the 4 to 1. Let's unpack that a little bit, right? What's in the numerator and what's in the denominator? So the denominator is, of course, the investment you're making in adaptation. The numerator has 3 components. It has the avoided damages, right? So if you actually make these investments, what's the avoided damages that you gain or the benefits that you gain from those adaptation investments? In some instances, the adaptation investment also comes with a real quote unquote financial return as well. And then the third is making these adaptation investments actually allows for additional capital to be invested in specific communities. If you think about the Thames Barrier on Canary Wharf, actually allowed for economic development in the Canary Wharf community. There's a range of returns, both in the quote unquote traditional way we think about returns, but also in terms of avoided damages that adaptation investments lead to. I start there because I think fundamentally it firstly needs stakeholders to rethink that adaptation investment equation and factor in the importance of both the avoided damages as well as these second order benefits that result from adaptation investments. We often just think about the immediate financial return from an investment, and so we need to rethink how we do pricing and assessments of these benefits. One of the types of analyses, for example, we've done for companies is when they think about their supply chains, investing in resilience in their supply chains, whether that's hardening facilities, diversifying suppliers, raising inventory levels, actually in the long run results in better financial returns for the company because the lost revenue from business interruption, from loss of inventory, if you, instead of thinking about the next quarterly earnings, if you actually look at it over a 10-year horizon, actually does result in a return. So it's not a very attractive point to make, but metrics matter as we think about many of these investments.
I'm going to come to Gautam and Jennifer to follow up on this. I know you want to jump in. I just want to say one point in response, that is in terms of investing in supply chain and resilience. It's an area that I've looked at and written a special report for us fairly recently. One of the things that the industries involved suggested to me was that though it might make sense, there is sometimes a first mover disadvantage. That is, if you're in a hyper competitive industry where margins are thin, and you know that investing in resilience will be better for your company longer term, but it requires some amount of money now that may reduce your margins, and your competitors don't make that investment. it's not required by regulation, you're going beyond the minimum, that you may face a competitive disadvantage. Historically, it's been very difficult to get chief executives to sign off or the board to sign off on these kinds of investments. But I think the picture is changing. What I'm hearing is that thanks in part to the disruptions of COVID to supply chains, at the board level, companies are taking a much more serious look at the risks, and including climate risks as well, and expanding the time horizons into which they're looking. So I think your point is being taken on board, but they are facing a bit of an uphill struggle in commoditized industries.
The rising climate risk, so it's actually having tangible damages in supply chains today in some geographies, and then the importance of risk disclosures. I think it is slow moving, but these are the three reasons why we are at least having more dialogue with companies about these types of adaptation and resilience investments. Please go ahead.
Great. I think Jennifer, what did we come to you? I saw a two-hander, so jump in and then we'll come back to Gautam for a final word on this before we move to the next topic.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks. I mean, I think what I wanted to say is to actually look more broadly out on resilience building, because it's so clear, and we just mentioned COVID and the disruption that is there of the inequalities that are rampant across our society. And if you were to reshift your economy so that you don't have the well-being of a small few into one that actually prioritizes healthcare, prioritizes economic well-being, prioritizes social systems, prioritizes climate, then you would have a more resilient society as a whole in order to deal, whether it be the climate impacts or another pandemic that comes. And I think it's really important for the policy debate, and that is policy, and that is mandatory policy that needs to come in and shift things. So that was just one point on the resilience. And then I just wanted to Gautam, also on the intergenerational equity, if I may, which is the German Constitutional Court recently found, I think it's very important, yes, adaptation and resilience. But what they found is that to create intergenerational equity, the government had to increase its target to reduce emissions. Because if they didn't, then the youth would be dealing not only with climate disruptions that would be very disruptive to their lives, but also the annual emission reduction rates that would be required, because it's not an if, it would be a when, were so disruptive that would also be unfair. And I think this argumentation that the court brought in for youth is just a game changer. And I think it brings a whole nother element of justice and transition into the room.
Gautam, a quick thought in response?
Absolutely. And just picking up on what Jennifer said, absolutely. I mean, look, the only long-term solution is to reduce emissions and pollution to levels that are safe. Adaptation can only do so much. But at the same time, we have to recognize that adaptation is critical and we're not doing enough about it, particularly to serve the most vulnerable. But here, hope you'll forgive me, Vijay, because just taking the opportunity, it's not often easy to get FaceTime with Mekhala, with Jennifer, and with you. So to ask a question and also to say and pick up a little bit on what are the kinds of whole of society transformation that is required? Because in essence, it seems like what we're talking about here is that we're not putting the right incentives in place to where the future harm suffered by a child is valued appropriately compared to a narrow financial benefit that is realized by an economy of today. And this perhaps gets back to what Mekhala's point was about the numerator of these benefits of adaptation solutions and climate action more broadly. What needs to be done to expand this numerator so we're properly valuing the benefits to children and future generations from effective climate action? And these are benefits not just from the perspective of a child. Yes, of course, the perspective of them being able to survive, grow, and thrive. From the perspective of a community to be able to continue to live in lands that their ancestors have inhabited for generations. And from the benefits to, for example, the world community, to where there is less pressure on social strife, on migration, on political instability. So how do we expand that numerator to properly value the benefits of climate and environmental action, particularly targeted towards children and the most vulnerable?
It's a powerful question. I think we've heard the moral argument. We heard a little bit from Jennifer about the legal argument in the German case, which also rests on a certain kind of obligation to the future, which is perhaps a moral precept. What I have seen is you can look at environmental economics, where the question of sustainable development, we can go back to a famous UN commission, the Brundtland Commission, that looked at what do we owe the future generations in terms of sustainability, in terms of the environment. And these questions have always been bedeviled by the economic selfishness of the current generation. And the way that it manifests into markets is the discount rate. It sounds incredibly dweeby, but hey, we're the economists, so we can talk about this. The discount rate that we apply sounds like a terribly obtuse thing, and we can dig into this if people want. Nikhila can knock me down if I'm wrong on this, but historically we tend to undervalue the future in lots of ways, and in particular when we think about the environmental future, we tend to overconsume resources and not think enough about what legacy we bequeath our children. And I think that is part of the problem that gets to how and why. Because you asked, what do we need to do differently to be able to provide a world for our children and grandchildren? And I think some of the forms that are embedded into our institutional structures in economics and finance may need to be challenged as well. But let me turn to our economics expert. What do you think, Nikhila?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the core, there's two challenges with this problem that we're trying to solve. It's uneven across space, sectors, geographies, right, which is what we started to talk about. It's also uneven across time, which is the point that Gautam made. So the question is, this is a little wonky economics idea, but like, how do we even out that unevenness, both in the today, because the impacts are both of physical climate risks and the climate transition are unevenly felt, but also over time. And so I think it leads to some ideas. I mean, this is the $1 trillion question, right? Not even the $1 billion question. This is the billions of people question. But I think it leads to a set of what I would call slightly mundane things, but also then big, profound things. So I think on the one hand, we do need to change our orthodoxies on how we measure, how we track. So this is things like the discount rate that is used in finance, how companies evaluate the ROI of different investments. There's a whole metrics standards part of this. I think there is a similarly a standards question related to how do we think about factoring in emissions, that externality that is climate, into things like trade regimes, into taxes, into subsidies. There's a how do we internalize this externality question. So a bunch of really metrics, mechanism standards that we need to revamp. I think secondly, there's this whole question of institutions. You use that phrase, Vijay, right? What are the new institutions that we need to create? What is the transformation that needs to happen to existing institutions? And that's everything from creating new forms of voluntary carbon markets, thinking about multilateral institutions differently, thinking about embedding and engaging with civil society institutions differently. So a lot of institutional adjustments, I think, to spread out and manage this unevenness. And then the big picture, which is conviction on the part of our public, private, social sector leaders, as well as citizens and consumers, right? Because ultimately, this will, as Gautam said, require us to recognize that this end state is a desirable end state and work in unity to get to that end state. And so that last one is almost the trickiest. I think the way we get there is to continue to emphasize the challenge of not taking action and the scale of these physical risks with which we are faced.
Jennifer, you have a thought on this topic?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I agree with some of what Nikhila just said. I mean, I think clearly some of these changing of what we're measuring, obviously GDP is not fit for purpose in 2021 anymore as a way of really measuring what's important. But I think particularly if you ask what's needed, I mean, the science has told us what's needed. And I think it's this combination of mandatory, not voluntary carbon markets. There's no time for voluntary corporate commitments anymore. They are a farce. I'm sorry, but they haven't worked. You can look at the literature. They're not working. And the idea of a voluntary carbon market that would allow offsets so that a company like Shell could just continue to keep its business model and try and plant trees everywhere. I think what we need to look at is actually national laws optimally working together across the world that phase out fossil fuels. And also the International Energy Agency has been really clear. We can't be exploring for any new fossil fuels right now. And that has to go hand in hand, to go back to the beginning, with the policies and that are required for that just transition. And it's not only the just transition of the workers, but it's in the policy development that the lower wealth part of our societies are taken into account so that they don't have to foot the bill. So who needs to pay? Well, BP, Shell, Chevron, Exxon, they need to pay. They've made a lot of money off of COVID. They get 10 million more for their packages. I think those types of societal debates where those who are responsible pay rather than those who are, not responsible at all is hard, but absolutely essential to get us there.
So Jennifer, I'm going to ask a question that's going to make me very unpopular with some in the audience. I expect a mailbag of hate mail, but what happens if the challenge of dealing with the transition, not just energy, but the broader climate transition that is required with the pace and intensity that we need to do it, is not compatible with all of the goals of environmental justice and social justice? That is, if in order to step on the gas, as it were, the zero carbon gas, and to get climate under control, to prevent the worst harms, which we've heard from Gautam particularly, affects children and the poorest the most, you may not be able to do it in the most just manner, to make some energy transitions that might enrich some fossil companies or other actors that are already elites. Would you support a transition that does involve some trade-offs? Or in your mind and your worldview, are there no trade-offs?
I guess my worldview is that the system, the economic system that has caused the climate chaos is the same economic system that has caused racial injustice, has caused, injustices against women, social injustices. So I think where we are now it is a much more intersectional debate where we're looking together at those issues, and looking at that together is where the solutions come from. I don't think we're in this black and white world anymore. What I'm seeing around the world are those different movements coming together, the policies that can actually address things together in a way. That's the direction that we need to go in. Alternative development models, not a continuation of these incremental changes, because we're seeing they're not resulting in the types of emission reductions or the justice that's needed.
So, but I'm not hearing a direct answer whether you think there may be trade-offs, difficult trade-offs to be made or not. What's your view? Because in real life, it'd be great to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and have everything, but sometimes there are tough trade-offs to be made.
Of course, I think that there will be a lot of choices and trade-offs that need to be made throughout. And I think what's most important is that the decision-making is made in an equitable and inclusive way. Right now, we have a system that completely prioritizes corporate interests and not the interests of people, indigenous peoples, youth. And so that needs to be put on the table. And then you need courageous leaders who will make those choices, which will need to be made. And there are choices in regards to the energy system and nature. There's choices in regards to all kinds of things. And we have to do that quickly. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that is ahead of us.
Nikolai, you were called out a few minutes ago by Jennifer. I'm going to give you a quick response on the role of markets and voluntary initiatives if you wanted to take that opportunity.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I would say this cannot be a one option or the other, right? I think this needs all systems, all stakeholders, all possible solutions response. And so I agree that in the long run, we will need to think about the role of carbon prices, compliance markets, legal reform, policy. But also, I think we need to think about the role of market mechanisms, because it does need to be a full system, all hands on deck response if we want to meet that 1.5C target.
Gautam, just a last final word from you. With Whitney Houston, I believe children are the future. But what do you say?
Absolutely. And just picking up on that, I mean, we should also remember here that, you know, children aren't only the worst victims of climate change, but also our best hope for a sustainable future. And so in this debate, when we're talking about markets and discount rates and everything else, we shouldn't discount, no pun intended, the importance of imbuing children and future generations with a sense of environmental sustainability, because the head always to some extent, always ends up going where the heart wants to go. And if the heart is already decided that environmental education, involvement in environmental activities, children taking their rightful place in policy debate so that they are the change makers of tomorrow. We shouldn't neglect that part of ensuring that environmental sustainability and climate action become part and parcel of the way future generations just think about the world.
Great. Thank you for ending us on a powerful and positive note. Let's hope that happens. Thank you to my speakers for a wonderful, fantastic, and really thought-provoking conversation. And also thank you to our audience. Our next session will start shortly, so please stay with us.